In 1987, there were 43 of them at the reunion. By 1995, there were 19. By 2003, there were 6. In 2011, there were 2. And on a Tuesday morning in October 2016, in a small house outside Macon, Georgia, a 93-year-old man named Harold Pruitt woke up, made his coffee, sat down at his kitchen table, and was, though he did not yet know it, though no one would formally confirm it for another 11 months, the only living man left from a company of 187 soldiers who had crossed the English Channel together in June of 1944. He found out he was the last one the way these things are usually found out, by a phone call that didn't come. His friend Sully, the second to last, the one Harold had spoken to every Sunday for 30 years, the one who'd been at his own wedding and at the birth of his children, and at the funerals of every wife either of them had buried, had died in his sleep in Tennessee. Harold learned this from Sully's daughter, who called to say her father had passed, and who said gently, almost apologetically, near the end of the conversation, "I think that makes you the last one, Mr. Pruitt. Daddy always said you would be." Harold sat with the phone in his hand for a long time after that call ended. Before I tell you what the next 7 years of his life looked like, carrying that particular distinction, I want to ask you directly, subscribe and share this final episode of the series. The last man standing from a military unit occupies a position that no one else in human history has occupied in quite the same way before, the sole remaining custodian of a collective memory that, when he goes, will have no living source left at all. Subscribe and hit the like button. Back to Harold. Back to the last man. The specific men who went before Harold, the 186 others, each of whom held the same distinction for some period of time before passing it forward, deserve to be understood as a sequence, because the title of Last Man Standing did not arrive only at Harold's door at the end. It traveled, one death at a time, through dozens of men across 7 decades, each of whom briefly carried a version of the weight Harold carried at the end, on a smaller and more bearable scale, before handing it on. Frank Doheny, the lieutenant who had organized that first reunion in 1947, lived until 1979, and was, for the final several years of his life, already beginning to feel what Harold would later feel in its fullest and most concentrated form. Doheny had been the keeper of the company roster, the man who tracked addresses and phone numbers and, increasingly as the decades passed, obituaries. He kept a single notebook beginning in 1947 in which he recorded the status of every man in Company F, not formally, not for any official purpose, simply because someone needed to know, and he had appointed himself the one who would know it. By the time Doheny died, the notebook had passed through nearly 70 names, each with a date beside it, and Doheny's handwriting in the later pages, according to the son who eventually inherited the notebook, grew visibly heavier and slower with each new entry, as though the act of writing the date down had become physically more difficult the more dates there were to write. He passed the notebook to a younger member of the company, a man named Pete Alvarez, who continued the practice for another decade, and then to a third keeper, and then eventually, sometime in the late 1990s, the notebook came to Harold himself, who kept it for the final 25 years, adding name after name after name, until the day came when there was no one left to add but the date of his own death, which of course he could not write himself, and which his granddaughter eventually entered on his behalf, closing a project that had begun 76 years earlier with a young lieutenant's simple desire to know where everyone had ended up. That notebook is now housed at the Regional Historical Society alongside Harold's recorded interviews, and researchers who have examined it describe it as one of the most quietly devastating documents in the archive collection, not because of any single entry, but because of the accumulated, plodding weight of watching 187 names slowly resolve, page by page, decade by decade, into a single name standing alone at the bottom of the final page, with no name beneath it. The specific experience of watching this list shrink, of being, at various points across 7 decades, the 20th to last, then the 10th to last, then the 3rd to last, then the 2nd to last, then finally the last, produced in Harold a particular and gradually intensifying form of awareness that he described in his 2021 interview with unusual precision. He said that for most of his life, the deaths of his fellow company members had felt like the ordinary losses that accumulate across any long life, sad, missed, but distributed, sharing the weight of grief among the many other men who had also known the deceased and who could also carry a portion of the memory. He said that somewhere around a point when the company had shrunk to single digits, the character of each subsequent death changed entirely. It was no longer a loss shared among many. It was a transfer of weight directly onto him, with no one left to share it. No one left who could say, "I remember that too," in quite the same way, because increasingly there was no one else left who had been there to remember at all. He described the death of the third-to-last man in 2009 as the moment the shift became undeniable. He said he had cried at funerals before, plenty of them, for plenty of these men, but he had cried differently at this one, not only for the man who had died, but for himself, in a way he found difficult to fully articulate even decades later. He said, "I think I understood, sitting there, that I was watching my own future happen to somebody else first, and that I was going to be the very last person standing in this particular room. And there is something about knowing that specifically, years in advance, that no amount of bravery from the war itself had prepared me for. The Germans never made me feel as alone as that funeral did." This admission that the slow, predictable, mathematically inevitable loneliness of outliving an entire unit could feel, by his own account, more isolating than actual combat, is one of the most striking statements in any of Harold's recorded interviews, and it points towards something the broader literature on military reunions and unit cohesion has only recently begun to document with real rigor, that the bond formed among men who survived combat together does not simply provide comfort. During the years immediately following the war, it becomes, for many of these men, the primary architecture of their entire emotional and psychological life, the bond against which every other relationship, marriages, friendships, even relationships with their own children, is implicitly measured, often unfavorably, for the remainder of their lives. Harold loved his wives. He loved his children. He said so, repeatedly and sincerely, in every interview he gave. And he also said, without apparent contradiction in his own mind, that no relationship he formed after 1945 ever fully matched the specific, total, instantaneous understanding he had shared with the men of Company F, because none of those later relationships had been forged in the same fire, and no amount of love built afterward could manufacture that particular kind of bond after fact. This is part why the reunions mattered so disproportionately to men like Harold across 7 decades of ordinary life, careers, marriages, children, and grandchildren. The reunion was not simply a pleasant annual gathering of old friends. It was the one remaining portal, once a year, back into the only relationships in which Harold ever felt that particular, complete form of being known. As the portal narrowed, 22 men, then 19, then 6, then 2, then none, Harold was not merely losing acquaintances. He was watching the only doorway back into his own most fully understood self slowly close, one hinge at a time, until the day arrived when there was no door left open at all, only a man alone in a kitchen in Georgia, holding a telephone, understanding completely and for the first time exactly what that closure would now mean for the remainder of his own life. Company F had landed at Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944, and had fought continuously across France, through the Hurtgen Forest, into the Battle of Bulge, and finally into Germany itself, until the war's end in May of 1945. Of the 187 men who had crossed the Channel together, 31 had been killed in action. Many more had been wounded and rotated out, some returning to the company later, some not. By the time the survivors mustered out in late 1945, the company that came home was already, in the way of all military units, scattering toward 150 separate American lives that would, for the most part, never intersect again in any organized way. What kept Company F together? What made it possible for Harold to even know, decades later, that he was the last one, was a reunion that one of the men, a former lieutenant named Frank Doheny, had organized in 1947 almost by accident, simply by writing letters to everyone whose address he could track down and asking if anyone wanted to meet up in Atlanta for a weekend. 22 men came. They had such a good time, by every account, that they decided to do it again the following year, and then the year after that, and the tradition simply continued, without much formal structure, for the next 69 years. Harold attended every single one of them, 69 consecutive years, missing not a single reunion, even through 2 of his own surgeries, a divorce, the deaths of 2 wives, and a stretch in the late 1970s when he could barely afford the gas money to drive there and slept in his car in the parking lot rather than pay for a motel room rather than miss it. When asked, much later, why the reunions mattered so completely to him, he said something that the interviewer who eventually recorded his oral history described as the single clearest distillation of what these gatherings meant to men who attended them across the decades. He said that for 1 week in a year, he did not have to explain anything to anybody because everyone else in the room already knew because they had been there too, and there was a specific and irreplaceable relief in being fully understood without having performed the work of being understood. This is worth dwelling on because it captures something essential about why the dwindling of these reunions, year after year, carried a weight that went far beyond ordinary nostalgia for old friends. Each man who stopped coming, through death, through illness, through the simple attrition of advancing age, did not just remove one more face from a room. He removed one more person who'd been there, who did not need things explained, who carried his own independent memory of the same events that could be compared against Harold's memory, corrected against it, confirmed by it. Harold was not simply losing friends, year after year, reunion after reunion. He was losing witnesses. He was watching the total pool of people on Earth who could verify his own memories of his own life shrink, conversation by conversation, funeral by funeral, until at last there was no one left who had seen what he had seen. By the early 2000s, the reunions had become small enough that they were held in members' living rooms rather than hotel banquet halls. Harold described the 2009 reunion, 6 men, in a converted garage in Ohio that one of them had fixed up as a den, as one of the most meaningful of his entire life, despite or perhaps because of how dramatically it had shrunk from the dozens who used to fill the Atlanta ballrooms. He said the 6 of them sat for nearly 9 hours that day, not performing stories for an audience the way the larger reunions sometimes had, but simply talking quietly about things none of them had ever said aloud before, because for the first time in 60 years a room felt small and safe enough that the things too heavy for a crowd finally felt sayable among the handful who remained. The last reunion with more than one man present was in 2014, when Harold and Sully met for a weekend at Sully's home in Tennessee. Just the 2 of them, both in their 90s, both moving slowly, both completely at ease in a way that neither man, by his own account, ever fully achieved with anyone else for the rest of his life. They knew that weekend, without saying it explicitly, that one of them would eventually be making the same trip alone, or that neither would be making it at all. Sully died 2 years later, in his sleep, and the phone call came, and Harold sat at his kitchen table holding a receiver, and the 70-year tradition that had once filled an Atlanta ballroom with young men in their 20s had now, by simple and unstoppable mathematics, come down precisely one person. Sitting alone in Georgia, who was now the entire surviving population of Company F, Harold lived for 7 more years after that phone call. He gave 3 separate oral history interviews during that period, one to a regional historical society in 2017, one to a documentary filmmaker in 2019, and a final, extensive one to the National World War II Museum's oral history program in 2021, conducted over 3 full days, in which he was asked gently and repeatedly to simply talk for as long and as freely as he wanted about anything at all that he remembered, because the interviewers understood, explicitly and without needing it, stated that whatever Harold did not say in that room would be lost from human knowledge the moment he died, in a way that was no longer true for almost any other category of historical information in the modern world. This is a specific and almost unbearable weight that falls on the last man standing from any unit, in any war, and it is worth being precise about what that weight actually consists of, because it is easy to sentimentalize and harder to fully understand. It is not simply the grief of having outlived friends, though that grief is real and was, by every account, profound and constant for Harold across those final 7 years. It is a much stranger and more specific burden of becoming, involuntarily, a kind of living archive, the last point of human contact with an entire set of experiences, conversations, jokes, small kindnesses, acts of courage, and acts of fear, and acts of simple boredom that existed nowhere else, in no other living mind, and that depended entirely on Harold choosing again and again to speak them aloud before his own memory or his own life ran out. Harold understood this responsibility with a clarity that several of his interviewers found remarkable. He told the documentary filmmaker in 2019, "I used to think my job was just to survive long enough to remember it all. I've come to understand my job now is to get out of my head and into somebody else's, because my head is going to stop working eventually, the same as everybody's does, and the things in it need a better home than that before it happens." He spent the final years of his life, by his own description, in a kind of quiet, deliberate race against his own mortality. Not frantic, not desperate, but steady and purposeful, recording in 3 separate extended interviews and in a self-published memoir he completed at 95, as much of Company F's collective experience as he could manage to transfer out of his own singular memory and into a form that could survive him. What Harold actually chose to say in those final recorded interviews, the specific content he selected to carry forward out of 77 years of memory, in the limited hours available to him, deserves close attention, because the choices he made about what to preserve reveal as much about the man as about the war he was describing. He did not lead, in any of the 3 interviews, with combat. The documentary filmmaker who recorded him in 2019 said she had arrived expecting, based on her experience with other veterans, that the early hours would be dominated by battle narrative, Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, the Bulge, and that the more personal material would need to be drawn out gradually, carefully, over the course of the conversation. Harold inverted this entirely. He spent the first several hours of that interview talking almost exclusively about the other men, their hometowns, their families, the food packages from home that got shared around regardless of whose name was on the label, the running jokes that had persisted for full 11 months of combat, and that none of them, by Harold's own admission, could fully explain to an outsider even decades later, because the jokes had stopped being about their original subject matter sometime in 1944, and had simply become a private language only the company understood. He talked about a private named Eugene Tibbets from rural Kentucky, who could not read but who had memorized, word for word, every letter his wife sent him, because he had a buddy who read each one aloud exactly once, and Eugene simply never forgot anything he heard. He talked about a sergeant named Walsh who insisted on shaving every single morning regardless of combat conditions, sometimes in freezing mud, because he said a man who looked like he'd given up was a man who actually had, and Walsh was determined never to look like that, not even once, not even the worst of it. He talked about a corporal whose name Harold could no longer fully recall. He said this directly into recording, with evident pain, that there was a man whose face and laugh and exact manner telling a joke he could remember in perfect detail, but whose actual name had slipped away sometime in his 80s, and that the specific loss, the loss of a name while the person himself remained vivid, was one of the cruelest tricks his aging memory had played on him. These were the things Harold prioritized when given limited hours and an explicit understanding that whatever he failed to say would disappear permanently. Not the tactics, not the campaigns, though he described those too competently and clearly when asked directly. The men, their particular, specific, unrepeatable humanity, the kind of detail that no official military history would ever think to record, and that existed, by the time of these interviews, nowhere else on Earth except inside one 90-something-year-old man's rapidly aging memory. He was explicit about why he made this choice. He told the museum interviewers in 2021, "Anybody can read a history book and learn what happened at the Bulge. I am probably not going to tell you anything in that department you couldn't find written down better somewhere else by somebody with access to maps and records I never had." But nobody else alive remembers that Eugene Tibbets could recite his wife's letters from memory, word for word, standing in a foxhole in December, when none of us could feel our own feet anymore, and his wife's handwriting was the only warm thing left in the world. If I don't say that today, right now, while I still can, then it just stops existing. That seems like a much bigger loss to me than one more soldier failing to fully explain troop movements that have already been explained perfectly well by people better qualified than me. This is, I think, the most important insight Harold's final years offer anyone thinking seriously about what is actually being lost as the last witnesses of the Second World War complete their natural span and depart. The institutional, tactical, strategic history of the war is by now comprehensively documented, cross-referenced, and unlikely to disappear regardless of how many veterans remain alive to confirm it. What is disappearing irrecoverably and on an accelerating timeline is the other kind of history, the Eugene Tibbets kind, the specific texture of what it actually felt like to be a particular human being, with a particular sense of humor and particular small private rituals, inside the enormous abstraction that history books simply call the war. Harold understood, with a clarity that came specifically from being the very last one, that this second kind of history existed nowhere but inside surviving human memory, and that his job, in the time remaining to him, was not to retell the war. It was to rescue the men he devoted, by his own estimate, roughly 60% of his combined recorded interview time across all 3 sessions to descriptions of individual men in the company, their personalities, their habits, their fates, their families back home, the specific things that made each of them a person rather than a name on a roster or a statistic in a casualty report. The museum's archivists, cataloging the 2021 interview after his death, noted that Harold had, in effect, single-handedly and in his final years, constructed something close to a complete oral biography of an entire infantry company, told through the accumulated small details of 186 individual lives, salvaged from total disappearance by one old man's deliberate decision about how to spend his last available hours of testimony. He died in March of 2023, at the age of 99, having outlived every other man who had crossed the English Channel beside him in June of 1944 by, in some cases, more than 2 decades. At his funeral, his granddaughter read a passage from his memoir's final chapter, in which Harold had written, with a plain and unadorned honesty that characterized everything he said in his last years, "I was not the bravest man in Company F. I was not the smartest or the strongest, or the one anybody would have picked back in 1944, as the one most likely to still be standing at the very end of all of this. I have spent a long time wondering why it was me. I don't have an answer. What I have instead is the simple fact of it and the responsibility that came with it. And I have tried, as hard as I know how, to be worthy of being the one who was left to tell it. That is the full accounting of the last man alive from his war unit, Harold Pruitt, who outlived 186 other soldiers, who carried 69 years of reunions and 77 years of memory entirely alone at the end, and who spent his final years working with quiet and total dedication to make sure that being the last one did not mean the story ended with him. Eugene Tibbets himself, the Kentucky private who could not read but who memorized his wife's letters word for word, survived the war and went home, and his own story, as Harold eventually learned through correspondence with Eugene's family decades later, offers a small but important counterpoint to this entire episode, because not every man's story ends in the kind of erasure Harold spent his final years fighting against. Eugene died in 1988, more than 3 decades before Harold, but his wife Loretta, the woman whose letters he had memorized in a Belgian foxhole, lived until 2014, and in her final years she gave her own oral history interview to a county historical society in Kentucky, in which she described, from her own side of that wartime correspondence, exactly what it felt like to write letters to a husband who could not read them himself but who, as she learned only after his return, had needed them read aloud to him only once before he carried every word permanently. She said that learning this, after the war, when Eugene finally explained why he never seemed confused about details from letters that should have long since blurred together in anyone else's memory, was one of the most quietly moving discoveries of her entire marriage. She said, "I have been writing to a man I thought might be losing my words of the war, the way everybody said letters got lost or smudged or finally just blended into a general feeling instead of specific memory. Instead, I found out I've been writing to a man who held on to every single word I ever sent him tighter than I held on to them myself." This detail survives only because 2 separate people, on 2 separate sides of the same wartime correspondence, each independently decided in their final years that the story deserved to be told before it disappeared with them. Harold did not know, when he mentioned Eugene Tibbets in his 2019 interview, that Loretta Tibbets had already recorded her own complimentary account 5 years earlier in a county archive 3 states away. The 2 recordings now exist side by side, cross-referenced by archivists who recognize connection, forming together a more complete picture of one small human story than either Harold or Loretta could have provided alone. This is worth noting because it complicates, slightly and usefully, the framing of Harold as the sole surviving custodian of his unit's memory. He was the last man from Company F specifically, but the full human story of any military unit was never contained only within a unit itself. It extended outward into wives and mothers and children in hometowns, into thousands of other people who held their own pieces of the same larger story, who were not soldiers, who never crossed any channel, but who carried their own irreplaceable fragments of the same total picture. Harold understood this, and in his later interviews, he made a point of naming family members whenever he could remember them, encouraging his interviewers explicitly to track down any surviving wives, children, or siblings of the men he described, precisely because he knew his own memory was rich but incomplete, and that the fullest possible account would always require more voices than just his own, even after his own voice became the very last one available from inside the company itself. The Historical Society that holds both the Pruitt and the Tibbets recordings has since used this connection as something of a model for their broader collection strategy, actively cross-referencing veteran interviews against any available family member testimony, precisely because Harold's example demonstrated so clearly how much richer the historical record becomes when it is not limited only to the men who held weapons, but extended to include everyone whose life intersected with theirs and who carried forward some piece of the same unrepeatable history. This broader collaborative effort, connecting Harold's account of Eugene Tibbets to Loretta's account of the same man from the home front, represents, in miniature, exactly the kind of work that oral history archives across the country have increasingly prioritized as the Second World War generation has continued its inevitable and now nearly complete passage out of living memory. Harold's specific genius, if that is not too strong a word for it, was recognizing this need years before most institutional archives had fully systematized the practice, and oriented his own final testimony specifically around the individual men rather than the campaigns, precisely because he understood, perhaps better than the historian studying him, that the campaigns were already safe and the men were not. Harold's relationship with his own family, his children and grandchildren, who watched him carry this particular weight across the final decade of his life, adds another essential dimension to this story, because the burden of being the last man standing did not remain contained within Harold alone. It rippled outward into the people who loved him and who had to find their own ways of supporting a man carrying something they could never fully share. His granddaughter, Emily, who eventually read from his memoir at his funeral, gave her own brief interview to the same museum program shortly after Harold's death, describing what it had been like to grow up as a grandchild of a man who attended the same reunion every single year of her childhood, who spoke on the phone with the same small handful of old friends every Sunday for decades, and who, in her words, got quieter every year, not sadder exactly, but quieter, like the room around him, kept getting bigger as the number of people in it kept getting smaller. She said the family had developed, without ever explicitly discussing it, a kind of protective instinct around the month of October, the anniversary of Sully's death and the month Harold had learned he was the last man. Every year, without being asked, someone in the family made sure to visit him during that specific week, not to discuss it directly unless he brought up himself, but simply be present, to make sure the house was not entirely silent during the days he had once described to her as the loudest quiet he had ever experienced. The specific quiet of phone that he knew, with complete certainty, was never again going to ring with that particular kind of call. Emily said that what surprised her most, looking back after his death, was how much energy Harold had poured into final years rather than simply enduring them. She said she had expected, when her grandfather first explained what it meant to be the last one, that he would become smaller, sadder, more withdrawn, and that for a period perhaps 18 months after Sully's death, this prediction had largely held true. But then, she said, something shifted in him, sometime in 2018, and he seemed to arrive at a decision that the family watched him act on with a kind of late-life purposefulness none of them had seen in him before. He began reaching out to historical societies. He began drafting his memoir. He requested, specifically and by name, to be connected with the National World War II Museum's oral history program, rather than waiting passively to be discovered by it. He treated his final years, Emily said, less like a sentence being served out and more like a job he'd been unexpectedly assigned and had decided, characteristically, to do as thoroughly and as well as he possibly could. This shift from passive grief to active stewardship is, I think, one of the most instructive elements of Harold's entire story, because it offers a model for how an individual person can respond to an otherwise unbearable and entirely involuntary burden. Harold did not choose to outlive 186 other men. He did not choose to become the sole surviving repository of 77 years of collective memory. But he did choose, deliberately and with evident determination, what to do with that unchosen circumstance once it arrived, and the choice he made to spend his final years actively transferring as much of that memory as possible into permanent, accessible, public form, transformed a burden that could easily have crushed a less determined man into something closer to a final, deliberate act of service to men who could no longer perform that service themselves. Emily said her grandfather told her, near the very end, that he had stopped thinking of himself primarily as the last man and started thinking of himself instead as the company's last working memory, a phrase he used specifically and repeatedly in his final year, and one that reframed the entire burden in a way that seemed, by every account from those closest to him, to bring him something like peace in his final months. He was not simply the one who happened to survive. He was the one whose job, specifically and uniquely, was to make sure survival was not the end of the story. The notebook that Frank Doheny began in 1947, the same one that traveled through 3 keepers before reaching Harold, and that Harold maintained until his own death, deserves one final and more detailed examination, because in many ways it functions as the truest physical artifact of this entire 76-year story, more revealing in some respects than any of the recorded interviews. The Historical Society that now houses has photographed every page for their digital archive, and researchers who have studied the full document describe a kind of accidental literary structure to it that none of its 4 keepers ever intended, but that emerges clearly when the pages are read in sequence. The early entries, in Doheny's hand to the late 1940s and 1950s, are brief and administrative: a name, a date, sometimes a single word like natural or accident or cancer, the bare minimum information needed to update a roster. As the decades progress and the keepers change, the entries grow gradually longer, more personal, more elegiac, as though each successive keeper understood, a little more clearly than the one before him, that the notebook was becoming something closer to a memorial register than a simple administrative record. By the time the notebook reached Harold in the late 1990s, the entries he wrote for each departed man ran to several sentences, sometimes a full paragraph. Not biographical summaries exactly, but small, specific, personal notes, the kind a friend writes rather than a record keeper. His entry for Sully, the second to last man, written in October 2016 with what his granddaughter later described as visibly shaking handwriting, reads in full: Sullivan Raymond J. died October 11th, 2016, in his sleep at home, surrounded by his family. The way a man ought to go after everything we saw. Sully and I spoke every Sunday for 30 years. He always said I'd be the last one, and joked that it was because I was too stubborn to die properly, the same way I was too stubborn to duck fast enough at Hurtgen. He was wrong about a lot of things over the years, but he was right about that. I am the last one now. I don't know yet what that means. I will try to find out, and write it down properly once I do. This final line, I will try to find out and write it down properly once I do, is, according to the Historical Society's lead archivist, one of the most quietly remarkable sentences in the entire 76-year document, because it captures Harold's emerging sense of purpose at the exact moment the burden first landed on him, before he had any framework yet for what that purpose would become. He did not yet know, in October 2016, that he would spend the next 7 years giving extended interviews, writing a memoir, and constructing what amounted to an oral biography of an entire company. He knew only that something significant had just happened to him, that it required understanding, and that whatever understanding he eventually arrived at deserved to be recorded properly rather than simply felt and forgotten. Everything that followed in his final 7 years can be read, in retrospect, as Harold keeping that one small promise to himself, written in a borrowed notebook on the worst night of October in 2016. The notebook's final entry, added not by Harold but by Emily on his behalf in March of 2023, simply reads, Pruitt Harold W. died March 14, 2023, age 99, the last man of Company F. He kept this notebook for 25 years and never missed an entry. He spent his final years making sure none of us would ever be forgotten. This notebook is now complete. There is no one left to add. That final sentence, there is no one left to add, closes a document that began in 1947 with a young lieutenant's casual curiosity about where everyone had ended up, and that ends 76 years later, having tracked a complete and total lifespan of an entire American infantry company, from the beaches of Normandy to the last breath of the last man, page by page, name by name, until the page itself simply runs out of names to write. The broader phenomenon that Harold's story represents, the gradual and now nearly complete disappearance of the last living witnesses to the Second World War, extends far beyond Company F, and it is worth situating Harold's specific experience within this larger demographic reality before closing this final episode of the series. The United States Department of Veterans Affairs has tracked, with increasing urgency over the past 2 decades, the declining population of living World War II veterans, and the numbers chart trajectory that mirrors almost exactly what happened within Company F on a national scale. Of the more than 16 million Americans who served in the war, fewer than 100,000 remain alive by the early 2020s, and that number continues to decline at a rate of several hundred per day. Within the next several years, by every demographic projection available, the last living American veteran of the Second World War will die, and the war will pass, for the first time since it began, entirely out of living memory and into history alone. This transition, from living memory into pure history, is not a subtle or gradual shift in the way historical understanding usually changes over time. It is a specific and identifiable threshold, a moment that can be dated precisely, after which an entirely different category of human knowledge becomes permanently unavailable. Before that threshold, anyone curious enough could, in principle, ask a living person what it had actually felt like. After that threshold, every single account of that lived experience exists only in whatever form someone thought to preserve before the last witness died. Harold understood that he was helping determine, in his own small corner of this vast transition, exactly how much would survive that threshold intact for Company F specifically, and he treated that responsibility by every account with the gravity it deserved. Historians who study oral history methodology have noted that this same threshold has already been crossed for previous generations of veterans. The First World War's last combat veteran died in 2011, an Australian veteran of the Western Front. An entire war that had once filled living rooms with grandfather stories now exists only in archives, photographs, and written records. The historians studying this transition describe a consistent and somewhat sobering pattern. The quality and texture of public understanding of a war changes measurably once it passes out of living memory, becoming flatter, more abstracted, more dependent on the surviving documentary record rather than the richer, messier, more human texture that living witnesses provide. Eugene Tibbets reciting his wife's letters from memory in a Belgian foxhole is exactly the kind of detail that risks being lost in this flattening, precisely because no official record would ever think to capture it, and only a witness like Harold, motivated specifically by his unique position as the last one, would think to preserve it before it was too late. This is why oral history programs across the country, including the National World War II Museum program that recorded Harold's final and most extensive interview, have accelerated their efforts dramatically over the past decade, racing against an unambiguous and rapidly closing window. Harold's interviews are not an isolated case. They are part of a much larger, more urgent national project conducted simultaneously by hundreds of historians and archivists across the country, each working with their own version of Harold, their own last man, their own closing window, their own irreplaceable witness whose memory will either be captured in the time remaining or lost permanently, and forever the moment that particular heart stops beating. Harold knew he was part of this larger urgency, even if he experienced it, day to day, simply as a specific and personal task of remembering Eugene Tibbets and Sergeant Walsh and the corporal whose name had slipped away. He was, in the end, one small but complete instance of an entire generation's final act of testimony, performed by a 99-year-old man in Georgia who understood, with total clarity, exactly what was at stake and whether he spoke or stayed silent, and who chose, consistently and until his final months, to speak. The series this episode concludes has tried, across 20 separate stories now, to do on a smaller scale exactly what Harold spent his final years doing for Company F. To insist that the war's true content was never primarily in the campaigns and the strategy and the dates that fill the history books, but in the specific, unrepeatable, irreplaceable texture of what it actually felt like to be a particular person living through a particular set of impossible circumstances. The soldier who came home and could not recognize his own family, the sons who grew up fatherless, the woman who waited 7 years for a man already dead, the sniper who could not stop counting, the medic who carried one phase for 53 years, the nurse who stayed silent for 4 decades, the pilot who flew again the next day, the men who stayed in Europe and never came home, the last letters written the night before, the interpreter trusted by neither side, the soldier declared dead while alive, the dog handler who lost his partner to a bureaucratic decision, the chaplain who carried thousands of confessions, the photographer who could not stop seeing the dying, the children sent away from London, the war bride who crossed an ocean, the soldier who threw his medal in a river, the twins separated by 11 feet, and now Harold, the last man who spent his final 7 years making sure that being the last one did not mean the silence had won. Each of these stories shares the same underlying conviction that has guided this entire series, that the war's real cost and the war's real meaning live in exactly the kind of detail that official history is least equipped to preserve, and that the only people who can rescue that detail before it disappears are the ordinary individuals who lived it, speaking for as long as they still can to anyone willing to listen carefully enough to receive what they are offering. Harold understood this better than almost anyone whose story this series is told, because his particular circumstance, being literally the last living source for an entire company's worth of irreplaceable human memory, made the stakes of speaking or staying silent more immediate and more absolute than for almost any other veteran of his generation. He chose to speak. He recorded 3 extended interviews. He wrote a memoir. He kept a notebook for 25 years and made sure someone would close it properly when he could no longer write it himself. He spent 60% of his final testimony talking not about himself, but about Eugene Tibbets and Sergeant Walsh and a corporal whose name he could no longer recall, but whose laugh he could still hear perfectly 77 years later, in the silence of his own kitchen in Georgia. He died in March of 2023, the last man of Company F, having outlived 186 other soldiers by margins ranging from a few months to more than 2 decades. The notebook that tracked all of their deaths is complete now, closed by his granddaughter's hand because his own could no longer hold the pen. There is no one left to add. But there is, because of what he chose to do with his final 7 years, a permanent and accessible record of who they were, not as names on a roster or statistics in a casualty report, but as specific, particular, unrepeatable human beings. Exactly the kind of detail this entire series has tried, in its own much smaller way, to preserve. Subscribe and share this final episode, and this series, with anyone who has ever wondered what the war actually costs beyond the maps and the dates and the strategic assessments. The cost was always this. It was always Eugene Tibbets in a Belgian foxhole, and Sully on the phone every Sunday for 30 years, and Harold alone in a Georgia kitchen, holding a telephone that would never again ring with that particular kind of call, and choosing, in the 7 years remaining to him, to make sure that none of it, none of the laughter, none of the shaving in frozen mud, none of the small private language, only 22 men in an Atlanta hotel ballroom in 1947 ever fully understood would disappear from the world without someone, somewhere, having had the chance to hear it first. That is the full accounting of the last man alive from his war unit, and the weight of being the only one left. He carried that weight for 7 years. He did not let it end with him. There's one further detail from Harold's 2021 museum interview that belongs in this final accounting, because it speaks directly to a question this entire series has implicitly asked across 20 episodes. What, in the end, is the actual purpose of telling these stories so many decades after the events themselves, to audiences who never lived through any of it and who can only receive these accounts secondhand, filtered through interview transcripts and old photographs and the imperfect, memories of very old men and women describing things that happened when they were young. The museum interviewer, near the end of the 3rd day of recording, asked Harold this question directly. What did he hope someone listening to this recording, decades from now, long after Harold himself was gone, would actually take from it? Harold considered the question for a long moment. The recording shows nearly a minute of silence by the archivist's notes. Before answering, he said, "I don't expect anybody listening to this in 50 years to feel what I felt. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it's really the point anyway. What I hope is that somebody hears about Eugene Tibbets memorizing his wife's letters, or Walsh shaving in the mud, or any of the rest of it, and they think, just for a minute, about somebody in their own life, maybe somebody old, somebody who seems like they've got a story nobody's bothered to ask about. And maybe that person goes and asks. Maybe that's the whole point of all this. Not that anybody fully understands what we went through, just that they understand there's always more there than what gets said out loud unless somebody takes the trouble to ask, and that the asking matters, and that it has to happen while there's still somebody there to answer. This answer, that the purpose of preserving the last witness's testimony is not primarily to transmit the specific content of what happened, but to model the act of asking before it's too late, reframes the entire project of oral history, and by extension reframes the entire purpose of the series. These 20 stories were never going to make anyone who hears them feel exactly what Walter felt watching his twin die 11 feet away, or what Eleanor felt crossing an ocean for a man she barely knew, or what Harold felt holding a phone in a Georgia kitchen, understanding for the first time that he was now the only one left. That kind of transmission is not actually possible. What is possible, and what Harold seemed to believe was the entire worthwhile point of the exercise, is the much smaller and much more achievable goal of teaching people to ask the question before the person capable of answering it is gone. Harold spent 99 years being a person nobody outside his immediate family and his dwindling circle of fellow veterans thought to ask about, for most of that span, simply because nobody knew there was anything in particular to ask. It was only in his final 7 years, once it became unmistakably clear that he was the very last source for an entire company's worth of vanishing history, that the asking finally began in earnest, and that he was given, almost by accident of demographic timing, the chance to say everything he'd been quietly carrying for nearly 8 decades. That is a final lesson this entire series leaves behind, embodied most completely in its final subject. Ask the people in your own life before it is too late. Ask the version of Harold sitting at your own kitchen table, the relative or the neighbor or the old friend whose stories you have always assumed there would be time for later. There will not always be time later. Harold knew this better than almost anyone, because for 7 years, he was a living proof of exactly how much disappears, permanently and silently, the moment the last person willing to answer is no longer there to be asked. Harold's grave sits today in a small veteran section of a cemetery outside Macon, Georgia, beside the graves of both his wives, and his headstone, and his own explicit instruction left with Emily before his death, carries no military rank, no unit designation, and no dates of service. It carries only his name, his birth and death years, and a single line he had specifically requested, the same line that closes his self-published memoir. He told the story so it would not end with him. Emily said her grandfather had been adamant about this particular wording in his final months, rejecting several more conventional military epitaphs the funeral home suggested, because he said he did not want to be remembered primarily as a soldier who had survived, but specifically as a man who had told the story, as though the telling itself, rather than the surviving, was the achievement he most wanted recorded for whoever eventually stood at his grave wondering who he had been. The reunion that Frank Doheny started almost by accident in 1947 in an Atlanta hotel ballroom that no longer exists ran for 69 consecutive years before its final iteration shrank to exactly 2 old men in a Tennessee living room, and then finally to 1 man alone in a Georgia kitchen with no one left to call. But the company itself, in the fullest sense of what that word actually meant to the men who served in it, did not end there. It ended instead in 3 recorded interviews, a self-published memoir, a 25-year notebook now sealed and complete, and a single line on a gravestone insisting correctly that the telling itself was what mattered most. That is a full and final accounting of the last man alive from his war unit, and the weight of being the only one left. Harold Pruitt carried that weight for 7 years, alone, in a way no one else could fully share. And in the end, he made sure the weight did not disappear with him. He gave away, piece by piece, story by story, until there was nothing left unsaid and nothing left for the silence to claim. This concludes Series B2. 20 stories, 20 lives, 1 war, told from the only angle that ever truly mattered, the human one. In the years since Harold's death, the Historical Society and the National World War II Museum have both reported a noticeable increase in family members reaching out to inquire about veterans in their own lineage who had never been formally interviewed, many of them citing Harold's story specifically, having encountered it through the documentary or the museum's published interview excerpts, as the reason they finally decided to ask before it was too late. Several of these later interviews captured testimony from men and women in their final months of life. Information that would otherwise have been lost entirely had Harold's own example not prompted someone, somewhere, to finally pick up the phone and ask the question. This is perhaps the most concrete and measurable legacy of Harold's final 7 years. Not only the preservation of Company F's own history, but the demonstrable effect his example had on encouraging other families to do the same before their own last witnesses were gone. The notebook is closed. The reunion ended. The last man is buried beside his wives in Georgia. But the asking, the specific act Harold believed mattered more than anything else he had to offer, continues, multiplying outward from his example into families and archives he never knew existed, exactly as he had hoped it might. That is a complete and final accounting of the last man alive from his war unit, and the weight of being the only one left,